I came across the Ovale through an original copy of the 1939 printing that was on display at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. In this copy, there was a title page with a bizarre, serpent-like, multifaceted creature that instantly grabbed my attention. It is as if the core essence of the content of these short stories was somehow contained in that image. This design was done, however, by the German lithographer Max Ernst, who was a lover of Carrington's during the build-up to World War II. They were both part of the Surrealist movement in France, and Carrington later became heavily involved with the works of the women's liberation movement in Mexico. In this brief exposition, we'll look at 6 short stories that comprise the Ovale, or La Dame Ovale as the print copies prescribe, and consider the surreal imagery and evocative metaphors therein. There's one quote from the prelude to the stories that sums it up quite nicely. The Oval Lady is an alchemical allegory in mythological disguise. In this first story, that carries the title of the entire series, La Dame Ovale, we are presented with a very ghostly and thin woman who appears in a windowsill and is dealing with a kind of parental trauma, specifically that from her father. She exhibits this by deciding not to drink or eat unless on some sort of binge. At some point, this woman attempts to play with a toy horse, perhaps as some kind of exemplification of female independence, but is quickly struck down by her father's disapproving words etched in her mind. It's said at some point that this woman at the same time looks very old and not a day older than 16. Perhaps we could say that this woman has daddy issues, or there's just some sort of complex built in her mind. At one point, the father figure is mentioned to be, quote, more near to a geometrical form than any other thing. This might hint at these vague ideas that other people's perceptions are perhaps mostly internal, abstract creations. We could see this story as almost being a kind of critique of the patriarchy through oddly placed metaphors. We'll see this theme explored later in other stories that deal with parental trauma and placing that in its proper destination. In this next story, titled The Debutante, we are presented with a girl who seems to be very friendly with animals, specifically with a hyena. She becomes so friendly with one hyena that she actually teaches it to speak like a human. As they begin to converse, this hyena and the girl, our main character, realize that they could team up to do something. Then, suddenly, the mother of our main character decides to throw an elaborate party in honor of her daughter. However, this party seems to be more about the mother than the daughter. In light of this, the daughter decides that she will not attend the party and will get the hyena, her friend, to go in her place. But in order for everyone at the party to believe it's a girl there and not a hyena, there has to be some sort of disguise. So the girl and the hyena hitch a mischievous plan to murder the maid and have the hyena consume the maid, but leave the face. So eat the entire body, but leave the face intact. Then the hyena will wear this other face and dress in the clothing of the girl and attend the dinner and fool everybody. Or so that is their plan. So they kill the maid. That happens without much pause. And they save the face. The hyena gets dressed up and heads to the party. Everything seems to be going okay, but then all of a sudden there's a booming scream that comes from downstairs while the girl hides in her room. Then the mother comes running up to the daughter in a rage, saying that the hyena that she tried to trick everyone with removed a mask and ravaged the birthday or the cake that was there for the event, and then jumped out the window, never to be seen again. So their plan didn't fool anybody, and now the girl is in a load of trouble. We can see this story as the author's way of describing the female side of an overbearing parent. Like the previous story was about the father, this is about the mother. And it's about a vain mother. It's about a controlling mother who wants to put on an appearance that she loves her daughter, whether that's the truth or not. So now in our next story, this is chapter 3, entitled White Rabbits. We're now in a city that is filled with awful air pollution. The air is described to be thick with black soot, and you can't even see across the street. Well, in the midst of this environment, a raven suddenly emerges and is noted to be fed bones by a neighbor who lives nearby. Now, ravens are often a symbol of the afterlife. Now, this old lady nearby who's given the bones to the raven also seems to be living in a rather depressing and putrid environment. In any case, she asks our main character if she has any rotting meat. This is a rather odd question, but later you'll see why it will be relevant. The main character doesn't have any rotten meat, but out of curiosity, the next day she gets some meat and lets it sit out and rot for some time. Then she comes over and brings it to them. Upon entering their building, she can see that this old lady is dressed very elegantly, but her skin seems to be white and translucent, almost like she's near death. once she gives this rotten meat to her neighbor, it's revealed that she has hundreds of white rabbits, pets, living in her apartment, and they love to feast on this carrion. So she begins to give it to them, and they start to fight like crazy over the food, like the rabid animals that they are. Now, she refers to them as her pets, but then she also reveals that her husband makes a stew of them once a week. So they're not exactly pets in the traditional sense. The husband then suddenly enters the rooms and declares there should not be any visitors. However, the wife protests, she lets her stay, and she almost asks our main character, don't you want to be like us? Don't you want to stay here? Now, this scares our main character quite a bit. Out of extreme fear, she bolts for the door as soon as she can. The story ends with her escaping the room and leaving the two old elderly people to their own devices with their rabbits. So in this story, we see a theme of death emerging and a theme of what is to be done with the elderly. We often see that people abandon their elders when they get to a point where they don't want to take care of them anymore. And this couple seems to have been left in that state in many, many years. I think at one point, the old lady says, I haven't seen a new face in 20 years. So it makes us think about who's really at fault, the people that left her or somebody else. We'll see this theme of death emerge later in other stories in this series, and keep a note of this. So now we come to perhaps the saddest and most heartfelt of the stories. It's called Beloved. The Beloved centers on a man sharing his grief with a somewhat uninterested listener. Something that people would now colloquially call trauma dumping. So, why does this man do this? Well, our main character, she steals a piece of fruit from a stand. And it turns out that this old man was hiding behind the stand for many years, waiting for someone to steal something so that he could subject them to his story. He goes and explains this to our character, and he brings her back into a room in front of where his fruit stand is. In this room is a woman lying very still on a bed. It appears that she's dead, but the man explains she's still warm. He goes on to explain who this woman is, and he's telling the story of the love of his life. He talks about how he met this woman's father, a man who liked to dry meats, and he happened to be an expert in this as a young man. So he was hired by this woman's father to help dry his lamb chops, and upon meeting this man's daughter, there was love at first sight, and not long after, they were married. On their wedding day, they decided to get into a boat on the Seine River in Paris and row down it somewhat aimlessly to honeymoon. As they did this, eventually the wife got very tired and they looked for a place to stay for the night. However, it was getting very late and there weren't many options, so they took the first they saw. It was a decrepit, sort of mysterious looking inn, and they go to the door, nobody answers, or somebody answers and they say, "I'm not the landlord, the wolf is the landlord." The wolves, of course, don't speak to them, but they circle them like prey. This obviously frightens them, and they beg to be let in to no avail. After some shenanigans, they're able to trick the wolves and they find their way inside of the cabin, but only into the kitchen area, which seems to be very poorly maintained and filth ridden. They try to sleep but do not succeed, and the wife seems to be poisoned or falls ill to the foul smells and the rats that are in the kitchen. She doesn't die at that moment, but the man states she was never the same from that day on. She spoke less and less from that moment on. As the man is telling this story, his eyes are so full of tears that he can no longer see. And our main character is listening to this story and takes advantage of this moment where he can't see, and she runs away with the fruit that she has stolen. So what this story says is that when people have grief, they tend to hide it, and they tend to only express it in these outbursts to people that don't really want to hear it. And it says that there's a power in keeping somebody alive through memory. There's a moment where the man says that even though she doesn't move anymore, he waters her like a plant every day, and she stays warm, and he thinks that it is her love, or is his love for her, that keeps her warm. So it is as if he cannot let go of this person that is clearly gone, and his watering of her is a way of attempting to keep her alive, in memory at least, without fully dealing with loss and the trauma associated. The fifth out of the 6 stories is called The Royal Command. In this story, our main character suddenly gets a summons in the mail from the royal family, and she is to meet the queen. She is very surprised that she has gotten this and immediately follows the instructions given therein. Once she arrives at the royal residence, and she is escorted to the queen, it is realized that she's gone a bit mad. Upon first glance, she is bathing in a large bath of goat milk and claims to use live sponges because they're healthier. Now, after some discussion, the queen speaks to our character and she offers her to take her place, saying that she no longer wishes to be the head of government and would like our main character to take her place. This throws our character off quite a bit, but she's immediately escorted to a room with the Prime Minister and other members of the government. After some discussion and a few very absurd and hilarious jokes aimed at the aristocracy and at royalty, it is determined that the Queen must be assassinated. And in order to assassinate the Queen, the members of the highest echelon of government shall play a series of games of checkers to decide who will get to assassinate the Queen. Now, at face value, this seems quite absurd, but it's taken quite seriously in the story. So, after quite a bit of discussion, it is determined that the assassination will be done by way of escorting the Queen into the royal zoo and specifically into the lion's den, where they will presumably eat her. After this is revealed, the series of checkers games commence, and they go all throughout the night. Then, after many, many hours, it is decided that our character has won this series of checkers games and is going to be the one that has the right to assassinate the Queen. At first, she's quite scared by this and does not want to do it. However, she is coerced by a cypress tree that pulls its roots out of the ground and begins to speak to her. This tree towers over her and puts a lot of fear into her, and she has no choice but to follow through with what she agreed to. So it's to be done immediately. She goes to the Queen's quarters. She wakes her up. It's quite early in the morning, and this is beautifully portrayed in the quote where she says, "In the dawn, nothing breathed. It was the peaceful hour, all petrified. Only light itself existed." Now, in this tranquil environment, she takes the Queen slowly into the zoo and slowly towards the lion's den. And the Queen asks several questions. Why are we going here? It's too early. We haven't given the lions their snacks yet. They're going to be angry. She murmurs a few words and appeases the Queen and continues to go on. You can tell that she feels a sense of ambivalence and duty to do what she's done, but also she's conflicted. The story ends right before she's pushed into the den. Now, this story is a great critique of royalty and of what it means to be in the aristocracy in the ruling class. It shows the absurdity of that kind of inequality, and it pokes fun at those people in power. It's also fitting that the Queen at the end is to be assassinated, So it shows that those who live in that kind of opulence at the expense of others deserve death. In our sixth and final story of La Dame Ovale, entitled Uncle Sam Carrington, we are presented with a story of yet another family that has shameful members in it. Now, in this family, there's an uncle and an aunt, that live in a disheveled home. And the way they live brings a bit of shame onto the family, and there is a desire to fix this. Our main character is particularly disgruntled by this, and she is the youngest daughter of a family, but in some ways the matriarch in a weird way. So she embarks on a kind of odyssey to help repair her family. And on this quest, she goes into the nearby woods, and she doesn't really keep a map with her. She just counts the trees that she walks by, and she thinks that she'll be able to return home by remembering those trees. However, at some point, she realizes that she can't count past 10 because she's a little girl, and she's lost all of a sudden. And as she's getting lost, the sun's going down, and the forest is coming alive with all sorts of mysterious creatures. At one point, she sees two cabbages fighting and destroying each other. Quite a surreal thought. She thinks she's in a dream, but then she remembers, oh, I haven't slept yet, so that can't be a dream. She continues to walk around, and she stumbles upon yet another disheveled home with two mysterious old ladies in it. It turns out that these mysterious old ladies actually help families sort of climb the social hierarchy in the society. They help acculture people in families to act in the way of the aristocratic class. So she explains that she wants to rid her family of these shameful members, and she wants to help them act more accultured and of a certain class. These ladies say they can help, but they will require a hefty payment for their services. And they also say they usually only work with people that are sort of associated with nobility, which her family is not, but aspires to. So she makes up a story, and that gives them reason to help her out. Now, these ladies then scurry off and tell the girl to stay exactly where she is. However, she doesn't listen, and she wants to see what they're doing and how they are finding this solution to her problem. She goes and she peeks around the building, and she sees the two ladies. They're in the backyard or the pasture next to this shed, and they're whipping a field of random vegetables and carrots and other produce, and they're whipping these plants as if they're people, and the plants are screaming in agony as if they are people as well. And there's quite an odd quote, that a chant almost, that these ladies are giving out towards these vegetables that they're whipping, and they say, quote, "It's necessary to suffer in order to go to heaven. Those who do not wear corsets will never arrive." So imagine that being repeated over and over again, and what this could mean. So at some point, these enchanted vegetables are then plucked out of the garden and given to our main character as some sort of magical solution to her aunt and uncle's issues. The main character then trades some goods that she has on her as payment and runs off in daylight back home. Now, it's not revealed what actually happens when she goes back home, but we can see this story as sort of a larger metaphor for how class practices and norms are made, and how they are ground into people, and also how arbitrary they are. Acting and dressing and talking a certain way are meaningless on their own, but in a context of tradition and in a context of gatekeeping, they take on a completely different meaning. the way this is conveyed here is through a surreal and absurd manner, but it does indeed show that elitism is in a weird way linked to occultism almost, and to ritualistic violence. All right, so that is La Dame Ovale, the Oval Lady. So in this section, we're just going to discuss some of the themes that were presented and look at the work as a whole and deconstruct it a bit and do a bit of a hermeneutical exercise. So, as we saw, some of the main themes that came out of this set of stories revolved around aristocracy and elitism, death and mourning, oddly enough, the consumption of flesh and leaving things to decay, challenging authority, dealing with parental issues, parental trauma, also non-human characters taking on human attributes that appears in many of these stories. And one that really struck me very particularly was the unreliable main character. It almost seems like this is the same person at different points in their life, and they are all kind of linked in an odd way. Even though there's only two stories that are linked by the mentioning of a horse. So that is just a pet theory of mine. But taking in to those main topics, those main themes, we can first think about Derrida. Now, from our lecture notes in week 4, we talked a bit about Derrida, and there's a quote here from our slides where it says, "For Derrida, we can identify multiple hidden meanings of a text as they are manifested through careful examination and contradictions and oppositions in the text, a process also called deconstruction. But these meanings are never fixed and interact with the reader's history, experience, etc." So, some of what I was saying when I went through and I gave my ad hoc take on each story, those are interpretations that I had out of it and are largely based around, my own experience with these things in my own life. So this is to say that Derrida is very much a relativist in the sense that you could derive many kinds of thematic undertones from the same text depending on the particular person reading these things. However, I would say that in these stories, it's quite clear that there is a literal story happening that is representing something much, much bigger. And that was very much alluded to at the very beginning, where it was said that, quote, "The Oval Lady is an alchemical allegory in mythological disguise." However, it's nice to take these stories at both literal and abstract points of view, because I do believe Carrington is trying to say things about her own life and say things about the environment she was in. She was definitely part of an upper crust, elitist, academic, and artist circle, and she seemed to have issues with that. and she seemed to like to critique it. And that kind of comes out as an undertone through many of these stories. It's also a good thing to note that she was, again, part of the surrealist movement along with Max Ernst and, most famously Pablo Picasso. And Kafka could be even seen as sort of an influence on the surrealist movement, at least the early part of the surrealist movement in the early 20th century. So, one of the tenets of surrealism is exactly that, to portray things in a dreamlike manner, in a symbolic way, where objects take on not only literal functions but many different layers of meaning. So you could say that Kafka, in a sense, is an influence on Carrington and an influence on this work, even though it's not exactly directly. It's probably the case that Carrington was mentored in a way by some people that knew Kafka in the surrealist movement in Europe at the time. So it's also evident that Carrington in The Oval Lady, in many of these stories, is evoking some pretty disturbing feelings. The idea of people being left in their apartments to feast on white rabbits until they die, or a man watering his wife because she's still warm even though she's been dead for 40 years. These are pretty disturbing images and situations where there's not really a resolution. I mean, think of The Beloved, about our man who's lost his wife. I mean, he's basically left sobbing to the point where he can't see anymore, and that's the end. That's very Kafkaesque. There's something very bleak and dark about not having the resolution in many of these stories. So that's where I would say Carrington, either consciously or subconsciously, is in a way influenced by Kafka. One other thing to note that I sort of alluded to earlier on is that the Surrealist movement was largely dominated by men, and Carrington was one of the only prominent females in the later part of the Surrealist movement. And she sort of channeled that ability to penetrate into a male-dominated field into other things later in her life. She spent a lot of time in Europe, but then during the war, World War II, she self-exiled to New York City. And we can think of New York City at that time as being the birthplace of a lot of modern art, right? Jackson Pollock and Rothko are in New York City at that time. She didn't seem to like that scene much either. It seemed to represent a lot of the elitism in academia from her previous studies, and a lot of the male dominance as well. So she leaves and she goes to Mexico City, and she continues to create, but she also gets involved in the very early stages of the women's liberation movement in Mexico. So we can look at The Oval Lady and almost see this as a prelude to her activism work within the feminist context, and also as a rather rare female perspective within surrealism, even though she collaborated with male artists to, say, do the cover for La Dame Ovale and to do some of the illustrations. There's still something very feminist going on here. All these characters are women, often young women that are quite wise for their age, and that are dealing with complex issues and things that a lot of us can relate to. So, in summation, I think that The Oval Lady is a very important piece of work. Carrington is a very underrated um, artist and creator, even though she was knighted by the British government. Um, we should look more at her work and looking at these things in the context of both where they were geographically, what cultural movement they fit into, and what previous influences from other eras may have had on impact they've had on her. I think that these all together show that La Dame Ovale is a story for us all.